I want to talk about leadership. I want to talk about the marks of a good leader. Matter of fact, if I were to title this message, that's probably what I would title it, the marks of a good leader. Perhaps maybe even indicators, what might be called indicators that a person is called to a level of leadership. I want to talk about that because everything does hinge on leadership. Whatever's going to be accomplished in life, somebody had to take a realm of leadership, a role of leadership in order for it to happen. Nothing happens by osmosis. Nothing just happens. Somebody has to pick up the mantle. Somebody has to take on the responsibility, take some steps of action, and do something in order for it to be accomplished. And that's what the role of leadership is. And I dare to say that there are many people whom God has placed a mantle of leadership that is hovering over you, but you have refused to step and put the mantle on. What a tragedy to have an assignment placed on your life to do something for which you refuse to step up and pick up the mantle and put it on. Somebody on your road, God has called them to do something that they have refused to do anything about. Somebody in your row, somebody in your section, somebody in vicinity of where you can reach out and touch has fallen down on the job of fulfilling the mandate that God has for them in their life. It is from the life of Nehemiah that I want to talk about today. Nehemiah chapter 1. Nehemiah is in a position where he is the king's cupbearer. And here's what the king's cupbearer does. The king's cupbearer has a responsibility of drinking from the king's cup before the king drinks, so that in case the king's drink has been poisoned, he gonna die first. How many of y'all say, I'm not applying for that job? I want to take a look at Nehemiah because here's a guy who really picks up the mantle of leadership. Here's a guy who accomplished some significant things in his life. And I want to preach through this whole first chapter, so I don't know if I'm going to get through all of it. I doubt that I will, but I'm not going to read all these 11 verses again, but that's where the message is coming from, these 11 verses of Nehemiah chapter 1. And Nehemiah has the assignment of being a king's cupbearer, and a challenge arises that he hears about the dilemma at his hometown of Jerusalem. He hears that he knows that the walls have been torn down, and because there are no walls around Jerusalem, it means that there's no protection. The walls gave protection to the people. The walls gave them a sense of security. The walls gave them a barrier between the enemies who might attack them, and those walls even gave them time to prepare. So they would put guards up on the walls, and those guards would look out, and if they saw an opposing army coming, if they saw enemies coming, they could prepare themselves. But 120 years prior to this time in Nehemiah's life, the walls had been torn down by King Nebuchadnezzar. He had torn down the walls, and so the city laid in rumbles. The people were afraid to move back into Jerusalem, and so there is fear and great distress among the people because the walls of Jerusalem have been torn down. Now here's the dilemma. The walls have been torn down for 120 years, and nobody did anything about it. This wasn't a dilemma of something that happened last week, last month. But for 120 years, nobody took an effort. Nobody did anything to try to rebuild the walls. Nobody had a burden. Nobody had care. Nobody had concern. They just let things remain as they were. And that reminds me of how our culture is developing today. We have a culture of people who from time to time find themselves ignoring, passing off situations we say is other people's responsibility. It's the government's job. The church ought to do that. The schools ought to do that. The police ought to do that. We pass it off on the next generation or the next person to do something about it. But Nehemiah is a man that has captured my heart because he did not pass off the responsibility of rebuilding the walls to somebody else. He decided to do something about it. That's what you call leadership. Go on and preach, Pastor Jenkins. Encourage yourself. And so Nehemiah does this. Nehemiah requests of his boss, the king, time off so he could go back and rebuild the walls of Jerusalem. And guess what? His boss gave him time off with pay. The boss gave him time off with pay, and the king gave him resources, material to rebuild the walls around Jerusalem. That's incredible. Thank you, 17 people, for seeing the significance of that. And so Nehemiah goes back to his hometown, and in 52 days, he completed something that had not been able to have been done in 120 years before. 52 days. Somebody say 52 days. Say it one more time, 52 days. There are some things that God wants to do in you, through you, in your life that other folk have not been able to accomplish, other people have not been able to do anything about. But there are people sitting in here, there are people sitting in your section, people sitting in your row, maybe even somebody sitting in your seat, that God has a mantle upon you for you to do something about something that needs to have something done about, and the assignment falls on you. But I am stressed out because you're sitting on your assets instead of doing what you're supposed to do. Say, go on and preach, Pastor. Say that. Say, go on and preach. Nehemiah steps to the plate and does something about the torn down walls. He comes back, he faces opposition, he faces criticism, he faces lies, he faces challenges, but he overcomes all of that because he has a mandate from God. He has a burden on his heart. He overcomes every obstacle put in his way, and in 52 days, he rebuilds the walls. He does in 52 days what nobody had been able to do in 120 years. I take my hat off to Nehemiah. I don't know whether you know it or not, but there's some Nehemiahs in here. There's some people who God is calling you to get up off of your seat, get off your behind, and he's calling you. There's a mandate for you to do something. So what did he do? Here's what he did. Look at the first thing. Three things I want to point out. Number one, in verse 2, look at the middle part of verse 2. He says, and I asked them concerning the Jews who had escaped, who had survived the captivity, and concerning Jerusalem. See that? He said, I asked them concerning the Jews who had escaped and had survived the captivity, and concerning Jerusalem. He said, I asked, I inquired. Good leaders inquire. Good leaders ask questions. Good leaders look at circumstances and have a concern. One of the problems with our culture today and in our communities is that people just don't care. We can roll on with our lives. We can see a high number of kids dropping out of schools. We can see people selling drugs on our corners. We can see marriages falling apart. We can see all kinds of drama, and we've pawned it off to somebody else. Nobody cares enough to do something about it. He asked the questions. He asked, he says, how are the people doing who escaped captivity? How are the people in Jerusalem doing? How are those who survived going through the captivity? How are people doing? They inquired. You see, this is a I don't care about nobody but me culture. We live in the midst of a society where nobody cares about me. If it don't relate to me, if it's not going to impact me, if it's not going to get me more money in my pocket, if it's not going to get me promoted on my job, if I'm not going to get me a new house, if it's not my kids, if it ain't have nothing to do with my family, I just don't care. That's the culture of today. But my assignment is to preach into your ears that as children of the Most High God, we have a responsibility that what causes God's heart to bleed ought to cause our hearts to bleed. What makes God cry ought to make you cry. You know, they show videos on TV with people. I saw the other day kids fighting. A bunch of kids attacked this one girl, and people just walking by like ain't nothing happened. Police officers standing there observing with no effort at all. We live in a culture where people don't care if it ain't for them. If it's not going to benefit them personally, they just don't care. Let me raise the banner. Let me elevate the flag and say that the children of the Most High God operate under a different parameter. I suspect, saints, that there's some things that God has burdened for you to have on your heart, but you're just so engrossed with your own personal agenda that you haven't taken the time to see what questions about the circumstances around you that God has called you to inquire about. Good leaders ask the right questions. Good leaders raises and poses the right investigation. Good leaders just don't walk by. They ask the right questions. Tell your neighbor, ask the right questions. If you're called to leadership, if God has called you to leadership, he will bring a concern in your heart. And as a matter of fact, I suspect to tell all of you, everybody in here, God has called you to leadership in some capacity in your life. Everybody's called to lead in something. Nehemiah did what nobody else did. He asked the right questions. He showed a concern, but that's not all he did. In verse number 4, it says, so it was when I heard these words, verse 4, that I sat down and wept and mourned for many days. So it was when I heard these words. Matter of fact, look at verse 3. Look at what he heard. And they said to me, the survivors who are left from the captivity in the province are there in great distress and reproach. The wall of Jerusalem is also broken down, and its gates are burned with fire. So it was when I heard these words that I sat down and wept and mourned for many days. You see, good leaders empathize. Somebody say empathize. The word empathize means that good leaders feel the pain of other people. Good leaders, people who are called to leadership, feel the pain. Matter of fact, Nehemiah felt so much pain for the circumstances of Jerusalem that the text says he sat down. You know what that word sat down means? It means he lost his breath. It took the breath out of him. He couldn't just keep on going on with his life as usual. It caused him to just to lose his breath where he had to sit down. When is the last time you heard about something that made you have to sit down? When was the last time something took your breath away? Matter of fact, it says he wept and he mourned for many days. This wasn't just a momentary, oh, ain't that bad. This guy empathized. He felt the pain of the people to where the text says he cried for many days. The culture today, we just don't cry. If you lose your job, you cry, but we're going through circumstances. Our marriages are falling apart. Our children are jacked up, and we don't cry. Go on and preach, Pastor. I think I will. Here your marriage has been ripped apart, family destroyed, and all of the drama with that, and you go on with life as though nothing happened. You treat it like you trading in a car that's broke. What has happened to our culture and our community that the things that ought to break our heart doesn't break our heart. We roll on like nothing happened. I'm preaching whether y'all say amen or not. Something ought to cause your heart to cry. Something about the circumstances that we live in ought to make you be able to step back and cause your breath to be taken away. Something that you see, something around you, something ought to make you say, wow, God help us. But no, not the culture that we live in. We are so self-centered, so self-focused, so zoomed in on what's about me, myself, and I, that we don't care about the world crumbling around us. God elevated Nehemiah and made him a great man because he cared. He cared about something that he didn't have to care about. Nehemiah could have stayed working his good job, if you want to call being the cupbearer a good job. He could have stayed right where he was. He could have stayed in the province of where he was and worked his job with no regard of what was happening in Jerusalem. But that's not what this man did. There was a mandate upon him. Here's what I discovered about God. When God has a call upon your life, he gives you a burden. He gives you a burden about something. He gives you a passion about it, an interest about it. I knew that I was called to preach when I was a teenager, not because I could speak very well, because I was a very quiet young man. I knew I was called to preach, not because I was articulate, because I could not talk well. I still don't have the best English skills in the world. I knew I was called to preach. Why? Not because I was the best looking in the camp, because I'm still an ugly dude. I knew I was called to preach. Why? Not because I was the smartest person, because I am not the sharpest knife in the drawer. I knew I was called to preach because I had a burden about reaching people, and the burden would not go away. I would go to church and hear people preaching, and my friends were sleeping as a teenager. My friends were passing notes. My friends were popping gum. My friends were laughing. And I said, I can take what I heard and I can communicate it to them. I had a burden that said, I can take that sermon I just heard and I can put it in a way that I know my peers will understand, and that burden would not go away. As a matter of fact, when I felt this burden, I went to Pastor Johnson, who was the pastor of this church at that time. And I said, Pastor, Reverend Johnson, I think I've been called to preach. I was 14 years old. What does a 14-year-old know about preaching? Nothing. But what I do know I had was a burden that wouldn't go away. And I look back at what transpired, and I can only say it was God. I wish I could tell y'all that I knew what I was doing. I didn't. And he said to me at 14, he said, you're a little young. But he said, keep praying. That's what he told me. And I kept praying, and the burden didn't go away. I saw my friends. I had a burden to reach the gospel with them. That's what my burden was. My burden was not to get up in front of people, because I was a shy person. I had a burden to get the gospel to them. I had a burden to reach my generation. I had a burden. So I went back to him and said, yes, I believe this is what God has called me to do. He says, okay, we will give you an opportunity to preach an initial sermon next year. And I went back to my pastor at 14 years of age and said, I cannot wait until next year. I wish I could tell you I was smart enough to know that, but it was the burden. It was the empathy that God had placed in my heart to reach my generation with the gospel. What I suspect is that there's some people here today who God has placed a burden on your life, but you keep pushing it off. You keep finding time for other things. You're too busy with other activities in your life. You got too much stuff. You got to work too many jobs, too many bills to pay. You got too many meetings to go to. You got to make it to your aerobics class. You got to make it to this meeting. You got to go to this sorority and this fraternity. To heck with the sororities and the fraternities and your aerobics class and this meeting and all these jobs. The greatest thing you have to answer is the mandate from God upon your life. And if you don't read that mandate, I tell you, God will orchestrate the things into your life. He will bring drama. He will bring pain. He will do whatever it takes, and he'll bring into your life until he gets your attention. He'll do whatever he has to do to help you reach the mandate that he has for you. And I suspect there's a lot of you in here who God has a mandate for you to do something. And by the way, everybody's not called to preach. Don't hear me call you to preach. I'm calling you to whatever it is God has called you to do. And for some of you, you've been called to be ushers. Some of you are called to the parking lot ministry. How do you know you've been called to the parking lot ministry? Because every time you pull into the parking lot and you see the drama in your pain, you get upset because you can't find no parking place. You have been called to the parking lot ministry. How do I know that there are people in here who've been called to the parking lot ministry? Because we don't have enough people to work the parking lot ministry. And I know that some of you are sitting on your assets. I know that everything we need to do as a church is in the house. Some of you get frustrated because you take your kids to Sunday school and the classes are all full. And you mad because you got in line and got to the front, got all the way up only to discover that the classes were full. And you got mad, got upset. You have been called to the Sunday school children's ministry. We got more classes, we got more classrooms, we just don't have more people who have a mandate to do anything about it. Go on and preach, Pastor. They ain't gonna say nothing. You in here? Yes, you is. You are in here. But you're too concerned about getting your own fix and getting your own praise on and getting your own word to take one Sunday out a month to serve in the Sunday school because it's all about you. You want to come every Sunday, drop off your kids, come and get your praise on, come on, get your word, get you some Pastor Jenkins. You can't take one Sunday off. I'm going to lose some members after this message today. Nehemiah empathized. He felt the pain. And he did something about it. He felt the pain. He felt the anxiety. He wept. He lamented. And then verse 5. Matter of fact, the end of verse 4 says, I was fasting and praying before the God of heaven. Look at that. I was fasting and praying before the God of heaven. See, good leaders, when they have problems, they approach God about what to do with the problem. Here's what bad leaders do, poor leadership. They will find a problem or a dilemma and complain. Nehemiah took it to God. Nehemiah prayed and said, okay, God, what should we do about it? I often get letters, emails from people complaining about this, complaining about that. And here's what I want to say. What you want me to do about it? I want to say to them, I'm not God. Don't bring all of your problems to think I can fix everything. Thank God for people who see a problem and instead of complaining about it, decide to do something about it. Let me thank those 17 people for that rousing applause. I appreciate that. He did something. He sought God, and God moved on his heart to do something about it. He didn't pawn it off on other people. He didn't put it on the politicians. He didn't put it on the religious people of the community. He didn't put it on other people. He didn't put it on the school or the police. He did something about it himself. Good leaders talk to God, and then God gives them specific instructions about what they are to do.